We need to ask a few questions and look at your business records right now.
Before anything, identify yourself clearly, name an agency, and tell me if you have a warrant.
It's just preliminary. It'll be quick if you cooperate.
Do you have a warrant or a court order, yes or no?
You're not in a position to refuse.
This is private property that I own.
The lead agent from the Drug Enforcement Administration walked into that Savannah bakery like he already had permission. He acted like the staff were going to fall in line, answer questions on the spot, and hand over records without slowing him down. He did not bring a warrant. He did not present a court order. He brought confidence, a badge, and the assumption that would be enough. That assumption collapsed when Dr. Alana Pierce stepped forward. She was not a frightened employee trying to keep her job. She owned the business and the building. She had built legitimate companies for years, and she understood exactly how government requests were supposed to work. The agent, Trent Callahan, treated the moment like a routine squeeze. Pierce treated it like a legal boundary. Right after this hook, quick question for you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments. And if you watch these stories because you like seeing people hold their ground and force accountability, hit like and subscribe. These situations only go one way when nobody pushes back. Now, here's how it started. It was March 2020, midday, Savannah, Georgia. The bakery was busy in the normal way. Customers waited near the counter. Staff moved between the register and the prep area. The space was open enough that most people could hear what was happening without trying. Two agents entered together. Callahan led. His partner stayed close, quiet, and watchful. They approached the counter and started pressing for what they described as preliminary questioning and access to business records. The request was framed like a simple step, as if it would be strange to hesitate. Pierce did not argue feelings or speculate about their reasons. She immediately focused on process. She required identification shown clearly, not a quick flash. Names, agency, and purpose needed to be visible. Then she asked the only question that mattered for what they were demanding, whether they had a warrant. When they did not produce one, she told them they were not getting records, and they were not questioning her staff inside her business. Callahan shifted tactics fast. He tried to make refusal sound suspicious. He leaned on authority instead of law. He implied that cooperation would make life easier and resistance would create problems. Pierce stayed calm and consistent. She repeated that the building was private property she owned and that he had no legal right to take records or conduct questioning there without proper authorization. She also told him to leave. That was the moment the room changed. Customers started watching closely. Staff stopped moving as casually as they had been. Phones came out first discreetly and then openly. People were not filming for entertainment. They were filming because they could sense the agent was pushing past what sounded reasonable. Callahan noticed the cameras and did not like it. His posture tightened and his tone sharpened. He stopped trying to sound polite and started applying pressure more directly. He raised the threat level by using the language of obstruction, suggesting that Pierce was committing a crime by refusing to comply. That move was the turning point because it revealed what he was really doing. He was not following a lawful process and hitting a wall. He was trying to convert a lawful refusal into an excuse for control. Pierce did not give him the reaction he wanted. She did not yell. She did not insult him. She did not step aside. She held the same position. Show legal authority or leave. The steadiness made Callahan's escalation look worse, especially in front of witnesses. Then he escalated again. He moved closer in a way meant to intimidate and signal physical enforcement. His partner stayed in place, still quiet, still backing the posture. Staff and customers kept recording. In a packed bakery, everyone could see that the owner was simply asserting her rights in her own building, while a federal agent tried to force compliance without a warrant. Callahan began moving as if an arrest was the next step, even though Pierce had not attacked anyone or interfered with an investigation. She had refused warrantless access and demanded they leave private property. That is when Special Agent Supervisor Renee Whitaker arrived. She did not walk in confused. She assessed quickly and took control. She separated the agents from Pierce and shut down the obstruction threat immediately. She ordered the agents to leave the bakery and made it clear the encounter had crossed a serious line. Callahan attempted to hold on to the situation, but the authority dynamic had changed. Once a supervisor publicly stops an agent mid-escalation, the attempt to force an arrest loses all cover. The agents left under Whitaker's direction. Pierce stayed composed through the exit. She did not chase them out or perform for the cameras. She focused on ending the unlawful pressure and keeping her staff safe. The bakery returned to normal movement, but the moment did not fade. Multiple people had recorded it from different angles, and the business had its own cameras as well. The evidence existed, and it was already spreading beyond the room. Footage from inside that bakery hit the internet the same day. Not because Pierce chased attention, but because there were too many witnesses and too many angles for it to stay private. People posted clips, others reposted them, and soon the story wasn't just agents visited a business. Viewers saw a federal agent pushing for questioning and records without a warrant, then threatening arrest when the owner refused. That detail made it spread faster. Most people don't know the fine points of search law, but they understand a basic line. Show legal authority if you want access to private records. The video made it obvious that the pressure came first and the paperwork came never. Comment sections filled with the same reactions. Some were angry and some were scared, a lot were personal. Business owners talked about agents showing up and acting like consent was mandatory. Former employees of different agencies weighed in about how often "just cooperate" got used as a shortcut around actual procedure. Local Savannah pages picked it up next. Then regional outlets. Then national coverage followed, because the clip was simple to understand and hard to defend. Inside the agency, the tone changed the moment the video started trending. Supervisors did not treat it like a minor misunderstanding. The footage showed the full sequence: the demand, the refusal, the threat, the attempted escalation, and the supervisor intervention. It also showed witnesses recording. That mattered because it eliminated the usual wiggle room where reports get written to make the scene sound cleaner than it looked. Whitaker's decision to pull the agents out immediately became the agency's first problem and its first protection at the same time. Her intervention protected the public and reduced harm in the moment, but it also signaled something else. Leadership recognized this as a serious violation right away. That meant they could not later pretend it was unclear. If a senior supervisor had to stop it in real time, it was already past the boundary. Reporters and activists began looking into Callahan within days. They found what Pierce's community already suspected. The bakery incident wasn't an isolated bad day. Complaints existed. Patterns existed. Prior claims involved aggressive tactics, warrantless or legally questionable searches, and confrontations that targeted Black citizens more often than coincidence could explain away. The public didn't need every document to understand the core contradiction. Callahan stayed in the field because his statistics looked productive: arrests, seizures, cases closed. Leadership had rewarded outcomes while minimizing the cost of how those outcomes were produced. That trade-off became the real story. People started asking how many complaints were needed before someone like Callahan got pulled off the street. One complaint could be noise. Two could be conflict. A long string across years with similar allegations is a warning, yet the warning had been managed instead of addressed. Whitaker's name surfaced too, and the reaction split. Some praised her because she showed up, took control, and stopped it. Others asked why it took a public incident to trigger real action. That question didn't land on her alone. It landed on the full supervisory chain that had kept Callahan moving from one situation to the next. Pierce stayed disciplined during the media storm. She did not present herself as a victim begging for sympathy. She presented herself as a business owner defending a lawful boundary. Her focus stayed on what viewers could see. No warrant, no access, no intimidation allowed on private property. That calm approach did something important. It prevented the story from drifting into personality drama. It forced everyone to talk about policy, training, oversight, and accountability. Pressure mounted fast. Community leaders demanded answers. Business associations asked for clarity on what owners should do when agents appear without paperwork. Civil rights organizations highlighted the broader pattern. Good numbers can hide bad conduct for years if supervisors choose to look away. Within the agency, an internal review started moving with urgency. This was not the slow motion process people usually expect. Visibility changes everything. The recordings made it difficult to deny. The witness count made it difficult to rewrite. Public attention made it difficult to delay. Callahan's partner became a secondary focus. Viewers saw him standing there while Callahan escalated. He did not take the lead, but he also did not stop it. That difference mattered later when disciplined decisions came down. Meanwhile, Pierce started preparing for what accountability actually looks like when the cameras stop. She gathered her own evidence. Security footage, employee statements, business documentation showing ownership and control of the property. She also documented the impact on operations, staff stress, and reputational risk. Smart move. Civil rights cases don't win on vibes. They win on facts, timelines, and clean records. A civil rights attorney entered the picture soon after. This was not a lawyer looking for quick headlines. It was someone who understood federal litigation and knew how juries react to abuse of authority when it is clearly recorded. The strategy wasn't just to argue that Pierce felt mistreated. The strategy was to show a pattern, show intent, and show the agency's tolerance of that pattern. By the end of the first stretch of coverage, the agency faced two problems at the same time. One problem was Callahan's conduct in that bakery. The bigger problem was what the bakery incident revealed about the system around him. The agency moved quickly once it became clear the footage was not going away. Special Agent Supervisor Renee Whitaker wrote the kind of incident summary that leaves no room for creative interpretation. Her report centered on what the public already saw. Two agents demanded access to records and attempted questioning inside a private business without a warrant, then escalated into threats when the owner asserted a basic constitutional boundary. That framing mattered because it forced the internal review to focus on legality and protocol instead of personality. Investigators pulled everything tied to that visit. They reviewed body-worn footage where it existed, camera footage from the bakery, and the phone videos posted online. They interviewed staff and customers. They collected ownership documentation that confirmed Pierce's control of the property. They also looked at what Callahan claimed he was doing there in the first place, because preliminary questioning without a warrant often hides a simple reality: fishing for something that can later be used to justify bigger action. Callahan tried to defend it as standard fieldwork. He pushed the idea that he was pursuing leads and expected cooperation. He framed Pierce as unhelpful. He leaned on the obstruction angle again, arguing that her refusal interfered with his job. That argument didn't hold up under review, because refusing warrantless access is not obstruction. It is the system working as designed. The moment he threatened arrest over that refusal, the situation stopped being a misunderstanding and became an abuse of authority problem. Whitaker's role also got examined, and she passed that test in a way that mattered. She arrived, assessed quickly, took command, removed the agents, and treated it as a serious violation immediately. The agency could not claim ignorance about the problem because a supervisor recognized it on site. Her intervention didn't excuse what happened before she arrived, but it did establish that leadership had a clear chance to stop harm in real time, and did it. Then the review expanded beyond that day. Once the bakery incident made Callahan's name public, complaints that had been sitting in the background became part of the record again. Internal affairs files, prior supervisory notes, and documented concerns from earlier encounters got pulled into the same timeline. The pattern was the same one the public was already talking about: aggressive approaches, questionable searches, repeated conflict with black citizens, and a tendency to treat consent like something he could demand. The most damaging point for the agency was not just that complaints existed. It was that the agency had options earlier and did not use them in a way that protected the public. You can counsel, you can retrain, you can restrict duties, you can pull someone from field operations, you can assign oversight. Someone made choices repeatedly that kept Callahan in situations where his approach produced predictable outcomes. That became the heart of the accountability conversation. Within weeks, Callahan lost his job. The termination was fast by federal standards because the case was clean. Clear conduct, clear video, clear supervisory intervention, and clear public pressure. Leadership could not drag it out quietly without making the agency look like it was protecting him again. Discipline hit the partner too, but it landed differently. He wasn't the one driving the confrontation, yet his presence mattered. He watched it happen and backed the posture without stopping it. Internal discipline reflected that difference in role, but the stain didn't wash off. Over time, he ended up leaving the agency. Pierce didn't treat those personnel moves as the finish line. She understood the basic problem. Termination handles one person. It does not address the system that tolerated the pattern long enough to let him walk into her business and try it again. So she filed a civil rights lawsuit. The complaint focused on unlawful pressure, abuse of authority, and the attempted use of arrest threats as leverage to obtain cooperation without legal process. Her legal team framed the case around constitutional violations and the practical damage caused when federal agents act as if warrants are optional. Discovery turned the case into a spotlight. Pierce's attorneys demanded the internal history connected to Callahan's conduct: prior complaints, internal communications, performance reviews, any documentation showing how leadership evaluated him and why he stayed in the field. The agency fought to limit what had to be produced because patterns are hard to defend once a jury sees them lined up in order. Pierce's side also prepared like professionals. Security footage was organized and preserved. Witnesses were identified early, not just staff, but customers, who recorded and remembered details. Business records were ready to show ownership and private property control. They also documented operational disruption, staff stress, and reputational consequences after the video spread. That matters in court because defendants love to minimize harm and call it a brief interaction. It was not brief for the people inside the bakery. It became a public event with real impact. As the trial date got closer, settlement discussions floated in and out. The agency had incentives to settle quietly. Pierce had incentives to push forward. She wasn't only seeking compensation. She wanted a verdict that said clearly that intimidation without legal authority is not law enforcement. That decision came with risk, because trials always do. Still, the recordings and witnesses shaped the case in a way defendants hate. Video shrinks the space for storytelling. It forces accountability to attach to behavior instead of excuses. By the time the case reached the courtroom calendar, the question wasn't whether the confrontation happened. The question was what the system was going to pay for allowing it to happen the way it did. Trial made everything sharper. In pretrial motions, the agency's attorneys tried narrowing what the jury would hear. They pushed to limit discussion of prior complaints and tried framing the bakery incident as a tense but isolated event. Pierce's side argued the opposite. The bakery incident only made sense when the jury understood why Callahan felt comfortable escalating without a warrant in a room full of witnesses. The judge allowed key parts of the record in. That shifted the whole case. Once jurors heard there had been earlier complaints with similar themes, the bakery footage stopped looking like a one-off mistake and started looking like the predictable result of tolerated behavior. Pierce testified with the same discipline she showed in the bakery. She laid out the sequence clearly. 2 agents arrived. They demanded immediate questioning and access to business records. No warrant appeared. She required credentials and lawful authority. Callahan escalated into obstruction language and moved toward an arrest, even though she stayed compliant and calm. She explained why she refused. She was protecting her staff and her business from a warrantless phishing attempt in her own building. Witnesses backed her up. Staff described how Callahan's tone shifted and how the threat level rose once Pierce did not give in. Customers confirmed the same thing from the other side of the room. Several videos in the bakery's security footage matched their accounts, and that consistency mattered because jurors don't like guessing. They like proof. Special Agent Supervisor Renee Whitaker also became a key piece of the story. Her arrival and decision to stop the agents in real time carried weight with the jury. It told them someone with authority saw the conduct and treated it as a problem immediately. That undercut any attempt to paint Pierce as difficult or uncooperative in a way that justified escalation. Callahan's defense tried the standard pivot. They argued he was doing his job, following leads, relying on experience, and dealing with someone who would not cooperate. They tried saying the obstruction language was a lawful warning. Pierce's attorneys kept dragging it back to one simple issue: legal process. No warrant, no authority to demand private records on the spot. No lawful basis to turn a refusal into an arrest threat. Then they added the point that hit hardest. Callahan didn't just ask. He pressured. He threatened. He tried to force compliance by manufacturing consequences. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a tactic. Closing arguments focused on punishment, not just repair. Pierce's team asked the jury to treat the case as a message about power. They argued that if an agent could walk into a business, demand records without paperwork, threaten arrest when refused, and face no serious consequences, then constitutional limits become optional in practice. They also pointed out the agency had warning signs long before this bakery and still kept him in the field. The jury came back with a verdict that made it clear they understood exactly what they were deciding. They awarded Dr. Alana Pierce $24.2 million in damages. The size of the award signaled more than compensation. It signaled punishment for abuse of authority and for a system that let the pattern continue until it became impossible to ignore. After the verdict, consequences kept rolling. Callahan was already gone, but the public now saw why he should have been removed earlier. The partner's discipline looked lighter by comparison, yet it still ended the same way over time. He left the agency. Supervisors faced internal heat too, because once a case becomes a national example, leadership cannot pretend the problem was invisible. Pierce did not treat the verdict like a personal trophy. She used it as leverage. Public testimony came first. She spoke about what happened in plain terms and kept her focus on business owners and workers who get pressured because agents expect compliance without paperwork. Then she helped build a legal support effort aimed at protecting other business owners facing unlawful searches and intimidation. It was practical help, not speeches. Guidance on what to ask, what to record, and how to document the encounter without escalating it. Community pressure followed that work. Local business groups pushed for clearer agency policies on contact with businesses. Civil rights groups used the case to argue for earlier intervention when complaint patterns appear. The public conversation shifted from, "This agent acted badly," to, "Why did the system keep putting him in position to act this way?" That's the part that stuck. This story did not end with one supervisor doing the right thing or one jury issuing a big number. The real critique was bigger and uglier. The system failed repeatedly by tolerating a documented pattern because the outcomes looked good on paper. The bakery incident only became the breaking point because it was filmed, witnessed, and impossible to spin. So here's the question people kept asking after the verdict. Why does accountability start after the 17th complaint in a viral video instead of after the first verified pattern? Drop your answer in the comments. What would you have done if federal agents came into your business demanding records without a warrant? Would you have stayed calm like Pierce did, or would the pressure have worked? If you want more real, grounded stories where power gets checked and accountability actually lands, like the video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe for more.
Hey, let me see your ID.
What's going on?
Just give me your ID.
Tell me what you really want.
What are you doing out here?
Waiting on the bus. That's it.
Turn around. I'm going to pat you down.
For what?
Do what I said. Turn around.
All right.
Officer Evan Kessler walked up like he'd already decided what Malik Grant was doing. A black man near the curb outside a busy bus terminal in downtown Cleveland, and Kessler treated that alone like probable cause. He demanded identification immediately and didn't give a clear lawful reason for the demand. Malik didn't match the energy. He stayed calm, kept his movements controlled, and answered as little as possible because he was protecting an active federal surveillance assignment that couldn't be discussed in public. Right there, the power game started. Kessler wanted compliance first, and explanation later. Malik wanted clarity first, because clarity is what separates a lawful stop from a fishing trip. Before the moment goes further, tell me where you're watching from, city and state. And if you like stories where cameras and procedures expose the truth, hit like and subscribe, because this one turns into a hard lesson in accountability. Now, rewind to the beginning of that curbside moment and how it escalated. The terminal area was busy in the way downtown transit hubs always are. People rotated through constantly. Some were waiting for rides. Some were lining up for buses. Some were just passing through. That kind of environment makes it easy for an officer to claim suspicious without ever pointing to anything specific. And that's exactly where this went. Malik stood near the curb like someone waiting and watching timing. No arguing with anyone. No approaching strangers. No obvious exchange. He looked like a person blending into the normal flow of the terminal. Kessler approached quickly and opened with a demand for ID. He didn't start with a reason Malik could understand and evaluate. He didn't say Malik matched a description. He didn't reference a call for service. He didn't identify a specific behavior he believed was criminal. He simply acted like Malik owed him answers, because Kessler had decided he did. Malik handled it the way trained, careful people handle it when they know they're being pulled into something messy. He kept his voice steady and his body language neutral. He asked whether he was being detained. That question should have been routine. It wasn't. Kessler took it as defiance. He treated basic questions as difficulty, and the tone changed from questioning to control. He repeated the demand for ID with more pressure and started framing Malik's calmness as suspicious. The goal shifted from figuring out what was happening to forcing Malik to submit. A few steps away, a bystander named Janelle Park noticed the way the stop was going and raised her phone. She didn't provoke anything. She didn't step into Kessler's space. She recorded steadily from a safe distance and kept Malik and Kessler in frame. Other people noticed and lifted their phones too, because public stops outside a terminal don't stay private anymore. Kessler saw the phones. He didn't slow down. He moved closer, talked over Malik, and set up the next escalation by implying Malik was uncooperative. Malik stayed controlled and kept his answers minimal. He didn't explain what he was doing there because he couldn't. He wasn't going to expose a federal surveillance assignment in front of a crowd, especially one that was now filming. Kessler switched tactics and announced he was going to pat Malik down. He leaned on the usual officer safety language without pointing to a specific threat. Malik didn't give him a reason to claim fear. He wasn't reaching into pockets. He wasn't making sudden moves. He wasn't clenching fists or taking an aggressive stance. He simply stood there and complied with positioning. The frisk happened in full view of the crowd and multiple phones. Malik stayed still. Kessler worked through the pat-down like he expected to find something because he had already built the story in his head. No weapon appeared. Nothing obvious showed up. That should have ended it. Instead, Kessler acted like the lack of a find was a new problem, not an answer. He started using stop resisting language, even though Malik's body stayed controlled and compliant. That phrase wasn't describing reality. It was shaping a narrative. Janelle's recording captured that mismatch clearly. Kessler saying one thing while Malik's posture showed another. With the crowd watching, Kessler made the choice to escalate again. He moved from frisk to handcuffs. Malik didn't fight. Malik didn't twist away. Malik didn't run. He stayed steady because he understood the stakes. If he reacted emotionally, it would give Kessler the exact justification he was trying to manufacture. Once the cuffs went on, Malik shifted the encounter away from Kessler and toward supervision. He still didn't disclose sensitive details to the crowd. He kept his voice contained and the information limited, but he said enough to force a higher-level response. He identified himself as a federal agent and demanded a supervisor verify credentials properly. That changed the situation instantly, not because Malik was trying to intimidate anyone, but because Kessler could no longer pretend this was a routine stop with a random civilian. A supervisor now had to step in, and the verification would either validate Kessler's actions or expose them in front of witnesses and cameras. Kessler had already committed to the wrong approach, and the evidence was already being recorded from multiple angles. Kessler kept Malik in cuffs like he'd won something. He stayed close, kept talking, and tried to control the crowd with his voice. It didn't work. People didn't move on. Phones stayed up. Janelle Park held her position and kept recording without getting in anyone's way. That steady angle mattered because it showed the full sequence instead of just the loudest moment. Malik didn't give Kessler anything to spin into a threat. His posture stayed neutral. His feet stayed planted. He didn't yank his arms. He didn't argue in circles. He focused on one outcome: get a supervisor here and get the verification done correctly. Kessler tried to keep the interaction at his level. He questioned Malik in the same pushy tone, still acting like Malik owed him explanations. Malik didn't start explaining the assignment, didn't name targets, didn't mention locations, didn't say anything that could compromise what he was doing. He kept it narrow and procedural, repeating that a supervisor needed to verify credentials properly. That's when Kessler made his next mistake. He treated the request for a supervisor like another challenge instead of a normal safeguard. He also kept leaning on the same resisting language, even though Malik's body stayed controlled on camera. You could see it in the crowd's reaction, too. People weren't just watching. They were tracking the mismatch between what Kessler said and what their eyes saw. Backup arrived first, another uniformed officer who took the scene at face value. That officer didn't slow anything down. He stood near Malik, watched Kessler, and followed Kessler's lead the way backups often do when they don't want to question their partner in public. It added pressure without adding clarity. Kessler looked more confident with another badge next to him. He started talking like the stop was already justified, like he didn't need to explain the beginning because he could narrate the middle. That's the trick. If you talk like something is already lawful, a lot of people assume it must be. Malik didn't. He kept the same calm tone, the same limited responses, and the same boundary. Supervisor, verification, and then end this. No public details. A few minutes later, Sergeant Colin Rivera showed up. He didn't come in loud. He didn't rush into Kessler's version of events. He looked at Malik in cuffs, looked at the crowd, looked at the phones, and immediately understood what kind of scene this was turning into. Rivera separated the problem before he separated the people. He pulled Kessler aside a few steps and told him to hold position. Rivera didn't do it to embarrass him. He did it to stop the momentum. Kessler had been driving the whole interaction, and Rivera needed the temperature to drop. Then Rivera walked over to Malik and spoke directly, in a controlled, professional way. He didn't demand a speech. He didn't make it a public interrogation. He kept it procedural. Malik gave the minimum necessary to trigger proper verification. He didn't announce anything to the crowd beyond what was required. He made it clear he had credentials and that they needed to be verified the correct way, through the right channels, not through curbside guessing. Rivera took that seriously. He didn't roll his eyes. He didn't treat it as an insult. He treated it like a job requirement. Verification didn't happen the way Kessler wanted, which was the whole point. Rivera didn't ask Malik to explain his work in front of strangers. He didn't ask for sensitive details out loud. He stepped away and handled it through procedure, using secure contact methods and proper identification checks. He also kept Kessler away from the process, so there was no pressure and no contamination. While Rivera verified, the crowd stayed quiet but focused. People could tell the energy had shifted. This wasn't Kessler performing control anymore. This was supervision taking the wheel. Kessler, meanwhile, tried to stay composed, but the posture gave him away. He kept watching Rivera, watching Malik, and watching the phones. He couldn't control the narrative anymore, and he knew it. Rivera came back with a different face than Kessler expected. Not confused, not doubtful. Certain. He told Kessler clearly and directly that the credentials checked out and the cuffs had to come off. No debate, no extra lecture in front of everyone. Simple order. Kessler hesitated. That hesitation became its own moment because it showed the conflict wasn't about safety. It was about ego. The crowd saw it. Janelle's camera saw it. Malik saw it. Rivera repeated the order. Kessler removed the handcuffs in front of the crowd, and it happened with multiple phones locked on his hands. Rivera didn't let it be hidden behind a car door or turn into a private correction. It stayed public because the mistake was public. Malik rubbed his wrists once and didn't celebrate. No speeches, no yelling, no victory lap. He just looked at Rivera and kept it professional. Rivera addressed Malik briefly, keeping it controlled, and then shifted to Kessler. He didn't scream at him. He didn't act like a tough guy. He spoke like a supervisor who understood liability and understood standards. Then Rivera did one more thing that mattered. He separated Malik from the crowd and the officers and gave him space to reset without being surrounded. That protected Malik's safety and protected the integrity of whatever he had been working on. Kessler didn't get arrested. He didn't get slammed into a car. Real life doesn't work like that. What he got was worse for a cop like him. A public correction on multiple recordings, with his own behavior clearly documented from the first demand to the final removal of cuffs. And Malik left the terminal area with his assignment disrupted, his identity exposed more than it should have been, and the certainty that Kessler was going to write a report that didn't match what the cameras captured. Kessler didn't treat what happened as a mistake. He treated it like a story he could rewrite on paper. By the end of his shift, he wrote a report that tried to justify the stop from the beginning. He didn't frame it as walking up and demanding ID without a clear reason. He framed it like he observed suspicious behavior first, then made a reasonable decision to investigate, then lawfully detain Malik based on escalating concerns. That's the move. Start the report with certainty, and readers who weren't there might assume the certainty came from facts. The problem was that this time, the facts came with timestamps. Malik documented the operational disruption immediately, not emotionally, logistically. He described how the stop exposed him in public, pulled attention to his presence, delayed his timeline, and forced him to reveal credentials in a setting where he had no control over who was recording. That disruption mattered because it wasn't just embarrassment. It created measurable risk to an active surveillance assignment. Janelle Park uploaded her video that night, not with a dramatic caption, just a clean description of what she filmed. Other angles surfaced too, including a second bystander video that caught Kessler's first approach and the initial ID demand clearly. Then the Bodycam footage got pulled. That's where Kessler lost control completely, because Bodycam doesn't care about how a report is written. It cares about sequence. The timeline was simple. Kessler approached. Immediate ID demand. No clear lawful reason stated. Malik asked whether he was detained. Kessler treated the question like a problem. The stop escalated from questions to frisk to cuffs. Stop resisting language appeared while Malik stayed controlled. Malik requested supervision and proper verification. Rivera arrived, separated parties, verified credentials correctly, and ordered cuffs removed in front of the crowd. No gaps, no mystery behavior in between. No hidden threat. No sudden move that forced Kessler's hand. When Internal Affairs compared the report to the footage, the inconsistencies weren't minor. The report described justification that didn't appear at the start of the video. The report implied resistance that the video didn't show. The report framed the detention as a response to Malik's conduct, while the footage showed Kessler escalating because Malik asked basic questions. That's when the investigation stopped being about a single curbside stop and turned into a credibility issue. Internal Affairs opened a formal case, not a coaching conversation. A real case with evidence review, interviews, and report integrity on the line. Then the city got outside legal pressure fast because Malik didn't handle this like a regular complainant. He had agency backing, documentation discipline, and a clear operational impact statement. An outside civil rights review got involved. That wasn't just for optics. It was because the evidence was clean, the crowd footage was public, and the report Bodycam mismatch raised a bigger question. If Kessler was willing to write around one video, how many other stops had he written around when there was no video? That review team requested Kessler's stop history. Not just arrests, stops, field interviews, Terry stops, ID demands, frisk frequency, complaint patterns, body cam activation patterns, report language patterns. And the pattern didn't look good. It wasn't one smoking gun. It was repetition. Stops clustered around the same areas. The same vague high crime framing. The same phrasing that turned normal behavior into suspicious indicators. The same escalation ladder where questions became non-compliance. The same stop resisting language showing up early in confrontations. A disproportionate number of black men stopped compared to other groups in similar contexts, based on the department's own records. Internal Affairs interviewed Kessler. He stuck to his report version. He described Malik's questions as evasive. He claimed Malik's posture made him fear a weapon. He emphasized officer safety and training. That didn't fix the problem. It made it worse, because it forced IA to make a choice. Accept the paper narrative or accept what the cameras showed. Cameras usually win when they're this clear. Rivera's role became important too. Supervisors don't just correct scenes, they create records. Rivera documented how verification was done, why it was done that way, and why the cuffs came off. Rivera didn't attack Kessler in writing. He simply described procedure and outcome. That created a second official account that aligned with the video, not with Kessler's report. By the time city attorneys reviewed the evidence, they weren't just looking at a bad stop. They were looking at exposure, bystander video plus body cam, public crowd, a federal agent on an active assignment, a report that didn't match reality, a supervisor who corrected the scene, a stop history pattern that suggested this wasn't rare behavior. That's not a case you explain away. That's a case you either fight and lose publicly or you settle and try to contain damage. And Kessler still had one last problem he couldn't talk his way out of. The words he used on scene. The early stop resisting language. The way he treated basic rights questions like disrespect. The way he escalated before he established a lawful reason. Janelle's footage made it easy for regular people to understand, and that's the most dangerous kind of evidence for a department. You didn't need a law degree to see what happened. All of it set up the final phase: discipline, civil payout negotiations, and policy fallout. Once Internal Affairs and the outside Civil Rights Review had the footage lined up against Kessler's report, the city's options got limited fast. This wasn't a case where the facts were unclear. The sequence was clean. The recordings showed the first demand, the lack of a clear, lawful reason stated, the escalation when Malik asked basic detention questions, and the jump to cuffs with stop resisting language that didn't match Malik's controlled behavior. City attorneys don't like cases where a jury can understand the problem in the first 30 seconds. Malik's side didn't argue this like it was a personal insult. They argued it like an operational disruption with civil rights violations attached. They documented time loss, exposure risk, mission interruption, and the forced disclosure of credentials in public. They also pointed out something the public always notices. Kessler didn't slow down when cameras came out. He sped up. That detail matters in court. It suggests he wasn't confused. He was committed. The outside reviewers didn't just focus on this stop. They put Kessler's history next to it. Same types of locations, similar vague language in reports, similar escalation patterns, complaints that didn't go anywhere until there was video. Once the reviewers showed the city that the stop wasn't an isolated lapse, settlement talks stopped being hypothetical. The city settled for $4 million. That number wasn't only about Malik. It was also about risk management. The city was paying to avoid trial testimony, avoid long discovery, avoid public release of even more stop data, and avoid a courtroom replay of Bodycam footage next to a report that didn't match it. Then discipline hit. Kessler didn't get reassigned quietly. He got terminated. The report inconsistency played a huge role because departments can defend bad judgment more easily than they can defend writing a false narrative after the fact. Once a cop's credibility collapses, everything they touch becomes a problem. Arrests, testimony, past cases. A city doesn't keep that liability around unless it wants more lawsuits. The department also knew the public had recordings from multiple angles. It wasn't just Bodycam. It was Janelle Park's video, plus other bystanders, plus crowd audio reacting in real time. That made it impossible to frame the outcome as misunderstanding without looking dishonest. After the settlement and the termination, the department rolled out changes they could point to in public and enforce internally. They tightened reasonable suspicion documentation so officers couldn't skip the why and jump straight to demands. They expanded stop data audits so patterns like Kessler's didn't hide in plain sight for years. They also started stricter enforcement on Bodycam and report consistency, because the easiest way to poison trust is letting officers write reports that don't match what the cameras show. Those changes weren't magic. Policy never fixes everything. But it did one thing the system often avoids. It admitted that vague suspicion plus ego can turn a curbside interaction into a civil rights violation in minutes. And Malik, he didn't become a celebrity. He didn't go on a victory tour. He went back to work. He also left that scene with a clear outcome. He stayed calm, protected sensitive details in public, forced the situation into supervision, and let verification do the talking. He didn't win because he yelled louder. He won because he stayed precise, while Kessler got sloppy on camera. Now here's the question for you. If you were standing in that crowd, and you saw a calm person getting escalated on without a clear reason, phones coming up, an officer getting louder, stop resisting being said, while the person stayed controlled, what would you do? Would you record? Would you speak up? Would you keep your distance and still document? Drop it in the comments, because how bystanders move in moments like that changes outcomes. If you want more stories like this, realistic situations, clean timelines, and accountability that actually lands, like the video, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to see how fast a routine stop can turn into a lawsuit when an officer skips the law.
Review
IDs, both of you, now.
before we give you anything. What's the legal reason you're
This is a
demanding
high-end
ID?
property. We got security concerns. Just cooperate and it ends.
Are we being detained or is this a request?
You're sitting here like you're casing the place.
What behavior made you say that?
Loitering, trespassing. I can make things
Officer Dylan Carter walked into that upscale hotel lobby thinking he was dealing with two people he could intimidate out of the room. He'd already decided Malcolm and Talia Hart didn't belong there, and he acted like his opinion was enough to turn a lounge chair into a crime scene. He approached them in the lobby lounge and pressed for identification right away. He didn't clearly explain why. No specific complaint. No stated call. No clear, lawful basis. Malcolm stayed seated. He kept his voice even. He asked what the legal reason was for the ID demand. Carter didn't answer cleanly. He talked around it, leaning on vague security language and the idea that the hotel wanted them checked out. He repeated the request, like repetition could replace justification. Malcolm didn't argue. He asked again, more precisely, whether Carter was detaining them or making a request. He asked what crime, if any, Carter believed was happening. Talia stayed quiet and watched closely. She wasn't making faces. She wasn't escalating. She simply understood where this kind of encounter could go. So she started recording audio without announcing it. Carter's tone tightened once he realized they weren't going to hand over ID just because he asked. He framed their calm questions as making it difficult. He started implying that refusing to comply was suspicious on its own. Malcolm kept his hands visible and his posture relaxed. He asked what facts Carter had, not what he assumed. He asked whether Carter had reasonable suspicion tied to something specific they did, not how they looked sitting in a hotel lounge. Carter shifted tactics and suggested they might be casing the property. Nothing in the scene supported that. They weren't walking the halls, they weren't checking doors, they weren't moving around taking notes. They were sitting, calm, quiet. Malcolm asked Carter what behavior made him say that. Carter didn't give a clear answer. He moved to threats instead. He brought up loitering and trespassing. That was another jump. Hotels can trespass people, sure, but Carter still wasn't stating that hotel management had actually asked for them to be removed, or that the couple had been told to leave. He was using those words to create pressure. Malcolm didn't flinch. He asked if the hotel had issued a trespass warning. He asked if management was present to confirm they were not allowed to be there. Carter's frustration showed in how he escalated again. He reached for the most damaging label he could throw into the situation without having to prove anything in that moment. He radioed out possible narcotics involvement. No concrete signs of drugs were visible. No clear indicators were described. No specific observation was offered. He still put it on the air. That kind of broadcast changes how other officers approach. It changes how staff and bystanders interpret what they're seeing. It also creates a record that can be reviewed later. Malcolm focused on that immediately. He asked what prompted the narcotics claim. Carter didn't give a factual explanation. He tried to pull the conversation back to ID and compliance. Talia stayed steady and kept recording. She didn't challenge Carter emotionally. She let him talk because she understood that a clean record mattered more than winning a verbal exchange. Carter called for another unit. A few minutes later, Officer Sophia Reyes arrived. Her approach looked different from the start. She didn't walk in assuming Carter was right. She scanned the scene and took a moment to understand what was happening. Malcolm and Talia were seated and calm. Carter was the one driving the tension. Reyes asked Carter what crime he was investigating. Carter tried to justify the stop with general statements about the property and suspicion. He referenced casing. He referenced his narcotics comment as if it was already supported. Reyes pressed for specifics. She asked what he saw. She asked what was reported. She asked what facts existed right now that justified detaining two people in a hotel lounge. Then she addressed the narcotics escalation directly. She challenged it on the record and questioned why it had been broadcast without clear indicators. That question mattered because it forced Carter to either provide real facts or admit he didn't have them. Malcolm and Talia stayed calm through all of it. They didn't take victory laps. They didn't taunt. They let Reyes do what a professional officer should do, separate assumptions from evidence. And at that point, Carter was boxed in. He'd escalated publicly. He'd put narcotics into radio traffic. He'd pressured for ID without a clearly stated lawful basis. Now, another officer was asking him in real time to explain himself. Reyes didn't let Carter steer the situation with labels. She kept pulling it back to basics. What was observed? What was reported? What law applied? Carter kept answering like he was trying to win an argument instead of explaining a detention. Carter pointed to the hotel environment and implied the couple didn't belong. He leaned on suspicious presence and the refusal to hand over ID as if that refusal created probable cause by itself. Reyes didn't accept that. She asked whether the hotel had actually requested a trespass warning or removal. Staff stood nearby, watching and saying as little as possible. Nobody stepped forward with a clear statement that Malcolm and Talia had been told to leave and refused. Carter tried again with loitering. Reyes pressed him to identify what specific ordinance he was relying on and what conduct met the elements. Carter couldn't tighten it up because there wasn't conduct to point to. Two people sitting quietly in a lobby lounge didn't magically become a crime because they didn't satisfy his curiosity. Then Reyes circled back to the radio traffic. She asked what objective indicators justified the narcotics mention. Carter gave a vague explanation that sounded more like a hunch than an observation. Reyes corrected that direction right away, because she understood what that kind of escalation does. It invites a higher risk response from everyone who hears it. Malcolm stayed composed and kept his tone respectful. He asked if he was free to leave. Carter didn't give a direct yes. He kept trying to keep them pinned in place without calling it a detention. That's when Talia finally spoke more. She kept it minimal and controlled. She asked Carter to confirm whether he was ordering them to remain or whether they could simply end the interaction. Carter doubled down. He claimed he needed identification to clear it up. He tried to make it sound like cooperation was the only reasonable outcome, and anything else meant guilt. Reyes didn't back him up. She kept asking for the legal basis. She also made it clear she wanted his facts straight, because she wasn't going to attach her name to a report built on guesswork. The lounge had gone quiet in that specific way public spaces get when everyone pretends they aren't listening while they listen to everything. A few guests glanced over and looked away. Staff hovered like they wanted the scene to end, but didn't want to contradict an officer either. Malcolm and Talia held their ground without making it personal. They didn't debate race out loud. They didn't insult Carter. They didn't raise their voices. They stayed in the lane that always hurts the most when the stop is weak: rules, definitions, and documented reasons. After several rounds of Carter trying to compel ID without stating a lawful reason, Malcolm and Talia made a decision. Not because they had to, because they could end the street theater and force the encounter into a proper lane. Malcolm produced federal credentials. Carter's posture changed immediately. His voice softened. He started using sir and ma'am energy. The same officer who had been talking about loitering and narcotics now looked like he wanted the last 10 minutes to disappear. Talia produced hers right after. The shift hit even harder because it made the earlier "you don't fit here" assumption look exactly like what it was. Reyes looked at the credentials, then looked back at Carter. Her expression didn't turn dramatic. It turned disappointed. She asked him again what facts he had before he escalated the encounter and broadcast narcotics over the radio. Carter tried to recover with polite explanations. He framed it as a misunderstanding and suggested he was just doing his job. The problem was the record. The radio traffic existed. The body cameras existed. Talia's audio existed. His words were already out there. Reyes told Carter a supervisor needed to be notified. Carter didn't argue that point. He wanted a supervisor now because he needed someone higher up to help manage what he'd started. A supervisor was called to the lobby. While they waited, Malcolm and Talia stayed calm and professional. They didn't threaten. They didn't make a scene. Malcolm explained in a measured way that they were willing to provide a full account through proper documentation, and that they had an audio recording of the interaction from early on. That detail landed hard, because it meant this couldn't be smoothed over with a vague report later. Reyes acknowledged it and made it clear in front of Carter that the recording should be submitted through the right process. She also kept the conversation tight to facts. When Carter approached, what he said, what he claimed, and what he put on the radio. Carter tried to regain control by acting cooperative. He asked for the credentials again, like rechecking them could reset the timeline. It didn't. The supervisor arrived with that controlled, careful demeanor supervisors get when they sense liability. They spoke with Malcolm and Talia respectfully, asked for a basic summary, and then turned to Carter for his version. Carter's version suddenly became smaller, less confident, less accusatory. The narcotics angle faded fast. The casing claim softened into concerns. The loitering and trespass talk became confusion. The supervisor asked what specific observations justified the narcotics broadcast. Carter didn't give anything concrete. Malcolm and Talia told the supervisor they would provide the complete recording along with a written statement through the correct channels, and they wanted all relevant records preserved. That included body camera footage and radio traffic. The supervisor acknowledged that request and said the incident would be reviewed. By the next morning, the incident wasn't just something that happened in a hotel lobby. It had a paper trail. Multiple trails, actually. Malcolm and Talia handled it the same way they handled Carter in person, calm, organized, and specific. They documented the timeline while it was fresh. Time they entered, where they sat, when Carter approached, when he demanded ID, when he implied casing, when he threatened loitering and trespass, the exact moment he broadcast possible narcotics involvement, the moment Reyes arrived and started questioning the facts, the credential reveal, the supervisor call. Then they packaged the audio properly. Not a dramatic social media upload, not an emotional post. They treated it like evidence because that's what it was. They prepared a written statement and referenced the existence of the recording, offering the full file through the department's complaint process and any investigator assigned. They also did something most people forget. They requested preservation. They asked for body camera footage from Carter and Reyes, dispatch recordings, and radio traffic logs tied to the event. They didn't ask casually. They used precise language that made it clear they expected the department to retain those records. At the same time, the hotel had its own internal reaction. The lounge manager and front desk staff had been present for part of the encounter. Even if nobody wanted to get in the middle of it at the time, the hotel still had cameras, internal notes, and an interest in avoiding a public scandal. Their security and management team pulled their own incident report because a police escalation in a lobby lounge doesn't look good for anyone involved. Carter had also created another problem for himself. He'd pulled other people into his story. That narcotics broadcast didn't just sit in his radio mic. It traveled. Dispatch heard it. Any unit monitoring the channel heard it. Supervisors could hear it later. That meant the department had more than a he said, she said. They had his own words in an official stream. Reyes's involvement mattered here too. She wasn't just a witness. She was a participant who questioned Carter's basis in real time. Her body camera would capture her asking for the underlying facts and challenging the narcotics angle. That isn't a small detail. It separates two civilians complaining from another officer flagged this as it happened. As the complaint moved forward, the response from the department got noticeably fast and careful. You could see why. The allegation wasn't just rudeness. It was escalation without lawful basis, pressure for identification without clear justification, and inaccurate or unsupported radio reporting that implied narcotics involvement. Those aren't tone issues. Those are policy and liability issues. Investigators requested the audio. Malcolm and Talia provided it through the proper channel, with a clear chain of custody. They also provided their written statement, and they asked for confirmation of receipt. On the department side, the internal review started collecting the obvious pieces. body camera footage from Carter, body camera footage from Reyes, dispatch and radio traffic recordings, any CAD notes tied to the call or self-initiated contact, supervisor's notes from the lobby, hotel camera footage were available. Statements from staff if the hotel cooperated. Carter, meanwhile, had to write his report and explain his decisions. That's where weak stops collapse. Reports force specifics. They force you to commit to what you claim you saw and why it mattered. Vague language becomes risky because it's easy to compare against body cam and radio audio. If Carter minimized the narcotics broadcast, the radio log would contradict him. If he claimed specific drug indicators, body camera footage would get checked for those indicators. If he leaned on trespass, investigators would ask who authorized it and when. If he leaned on loitering, they'd look for the elements of the offense and whether any warning or request to leave happened first. The department also had to consider Reyes's unseen actions. Her questions weren't just interpersonal disagreement. They were on-record challenges to the justification. That gave internal investigators a clear reference point. Another officer heard the same situation and didn't see the factual basis, Carter claimed. Within days, the tone from the department shifted into formal mode. A case number, an assigned investigator, request for supplemental information, confirmation that evidence was being reviewed. It wasn't friendly, it was careful. The kind of careful that happens when decision makers already suspect the audio is bad. Malcolm and Talia stayed consistent. They didn't chase attention. They didn't do interviews. They didn't need to. They kept everything inside the system that creates consequences, documentation, records, and policy review. And while that was happening, Carter's choices kept compounding. Because every escalation he made in that lobby had created another checkpoint for investigators to test. Internal Affairs didn't have to guess what happened in that lounge. They had Carter's own radio traffic. They had body camera footage. They had Reyes on camera asking him what crime he was investigating. They had Malcolm and Talia's audio starting early, before anyone could claim the recording only captured the end. When investigators lined it all up, Carter's timeline didn't hold. The review focused on a few basic questions that always decide these cases. Did Carter have a lawful reason to pressure two people for identification in a hotel lounge? Did he clearly state a legal basis for a detention? Or did he try to trap them in a detention without naming it? Did he escalate from vague suspicion into threats like loitering and trespass without the necessary steps and facts? Did he broadcast possible narcotics involvement based on real indicators? Or did he throw that label out to justify his own posture and bring backup in hotter? That last one mattered the most, because it wasn't just attitude. It was inaccurate reporting over official channels tied to a serious accusation with no concrete signs documented in the moment. Reyes's involvement kept showing up in the investigation for one simple reason. She asked the same questions Malcolm and Talia asked, on the record, as an officer. She didn't treat Carter's assumptions like facts. She treated them like claims that needed support. Investigators pulled dispatch audio and radio logs. Carter's narcotics broadcast was there, clear as day. Then they checked what followed. There was no discovery, no search, no substance, no articulable observation that matched the escalation. They reviewed body cam from Carter. His initial approach showed the same pattern the couple described. Pressure first, explanation later. He didn't open with a clear, lawful basis. He opened with control. They reviewed Reyes's body cam. She arrived and immediately challenged the foundation of the stop. She questioned the narcotics mention. She asked what crime was being investigated. That created a clean checkpoint in the footage where Carter had to justify himself and couldn't. They reviewed the supervisor's response. The supervisor's questions were practical and direct. Why narcotics? Why ID? What facts? Carter didn't give solid answers then either. Then the department compared Carter's written reporting to all of that. If he wrote it vaguely, the footage exposed the gaps. If he wrote it confidently, The audio exposed the inaccuracies. That's how this moved from complaint to sustained. The department concluded Carter violated policy tied to unlawful escalation and inaccurate reporting. The finding didn't hinge on one sentence. It was the whole chain, approaching without a clear basis, pressuring for ID, stacking threats, then amplifying the situation through the narcotics broadcasts without supporting facts. Carter lost his job. And it wasn't framed as a quiet, mutual separation. The department cited policy violations connected to the escalation and the reporting, the kind of language departments use when they know the record would be ugly in court. Malcolm and Talia didn't treat it like a victory lap. They treated it like confirmation that their approach worked. They stayed calm during the stop. They didn't match Carter's energy. They asked precise questions. Talia recorded early and quietly. They offered the recording through the proper process instead of trying to win the internet. They requested preservation. They made the department deal with the facts. That's why it moved. This incident also created internal ripples. Supervisors don't like officers who turn nothing into a liability. Training reminders and roll call briefings typically follow cases like this, because leadership wants fewer self-initiated stops based on vibes and fewer radio escalations that can't be defended later. Reyes came out of it looking like what backup is supposed to be. Not a hype squad, not a second bully, a professional who checks the facts and refuses to help build a fake narrative. And if you're watching this wondering what you would have done, here's the reality. Most people fold because they think compliance will end it. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it invites more. The Hearts didn't win because they got loud. They won because they stayed controlled, asked the right questions, and kept a record. So let me ask you straight. If an officer demanded your ID with explaining a lawful reason, would you hand it over just to make it go away? Or would you ask what you're being detained for? Drop your answer in the comments and share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this, realistic, modern, and focused on accountability, make sure you subscribe.
Hey, stop right there. Don't move. Hands where I can see them.
I'm Deputy U.S. Marshal Marcus Reed. I'm traveling on official orders.
That uniform doesn't mean anything to me. Show me something real.
I can give you my credentials and orders.
Put the bag down.
Please verify through dispatch or a supervisor.
You're detained.
Officer Ethan Crowley believed he was dealing with a fake, another guy trying to look important in a busy airport. He figured it would be simple. Stop him, check him, search his bag, prove he didn't belong, and send him on his way embarrassed. What Crowley didn't understand was that the man standing in front of him wasn't pretending to be law enforcement. He was a deputy U.S. Marshal on official orders. And the moment Crowley decided to escalate, he turned a routine contact into a recorded civil rights incident. Before we rewind, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments. And if you like stories where arrogance meets documentation and accountability, hit like and subscribe, because this one ends with consequences. This started inside Denver International Airport during a stretch of heavy foot traffic where people were rushing between gates and nobody had patience for delays. Crowley and his partner, Officer Kyle Benton, were working patrol in the terminal. They weren't at a checkpoint. This was the public side of the airport, where officers rely on discretion, quick judgments, and constant scanning for anything that looks off. Marcus Reed didn't look off. He looked official. Reed moved through the terminal in a formal U.S. Marshal uniform, carrying a travel bag and paperwork for an official assignment. He wasn't showing off. He wasn't looking for attention. He had the posture of someone used to airports, used to procedures, and used to getting from one point to the next without drama. Crowley stepped into his path and stopped him anyway. Crowley demanded Reed's identification and immediately treated the uniform as suspicious. Instead of asking routine verification questions, he framed it like an accusation. Reed responded the way trained federal officers do in public. Calm tone, controlled movements, hands visible, credentials presented without arguing. Crowley didn't accept what he was looking at. Reed provided his marshal credentials and travel documentation, and indicated he was traveling under official orders. The simple next step was obvious. Confirm through proper channels, call a supervisor, verify the credentials, and let him continue. Reed's demeanor made it easier, not harder. He didn't posture, he didn't get loud. He kept it professional. Crowley pushed harder. He demanded Reed's bag and insisted on searching it right there. Reed didn't refuse in a confrontational way, but he didn't surrender his rights or the process either. He kept offering the clean, standard solution. Verify his identity through dispatch and a supervisor, then handle any necessary checks the right way. Crowley took that as resistance. Benton stayed close beside Crowley. He didn't calm the situation down. He didn't step in with a moderating voice. He backed Crowley's body language and let Crowley drive the contact. People around them started watching. Airports have a lot of noise, but tension stands out. A uniformed man being pressed by two officers catches attention fast. Travelers slowed down. Someone pulled out a phone. Then another person did the same from a different angle. Crowley had body cameras. Reed had paperwork. The public had cameras too. Crowley kept talking as if Reed's credentials were a prop. The comments turned from suspicion into something uglier. He implied Reed didn't match what a real marshal should be. He suggested the uniform was stolen or fake. The tone carried that familiar message without needing a speech. Crowley wasn't evaluating evidence. He was evaluating whether Reed looked like he belonged in the role. Reed stayed steady. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make sudden moves. He didn't give Crowley any excuse to claim he felt threatened. He kept his hands visible and his responses brief. That kind of self-control doesn't come from being timid. It comes from knowing how quickly a situation can be rewritten if you give the wrong person an opening. Crowley escalated anyway. He announced he was detaining Reed and moved in as if Reed had done something dangerous. Reed complied. No swinging arms, no pulling away, no attempt to run. Compliance didn't slow Crowley down. Crowley forced Reed to the ground in front of the crowd and put him in handcuffs while bystanders recorded and his body camera captured everything. Reed stayed on the floor, controlled and silent, waiting for the only thing that mattered now, verification through someone who would actually look at facts. That's when Sergeant Alicia Moreno arrived. Sergeant Alicia Moreno walked up into a scene that already looked bad from a distance. A man in a formal U.S. Marshal uniform was on the floor in handcuffs. Two airport officers were standing over him like they'd just stopped a threat. People had formed a loose ring around the situation, and several phones were up recording. Moreno didn't waste time trying to look tough. She went straight to information. Crowley started talking immediately, trying to control the story. He framed Reed like an imposter, acted like the stop had been justified, and tried to make Reed's calm compliance sound suspicious. Benton stood with him, backing the posture, letting Crowley narrate. Moreno focused on Reed. Reed kept the same controlled demeanor. He indicated he had already provided credentials and travel documentation and had asked for proper verification. He didn't plead. He didn't perform. He stayed professional because he knew the first supervisor who actually checked facts would end this. Moreno requested Reed's marshal credentials and orders. Within seconds, the difference between suspicion and reality became obvious. The identification was legitimate. The documentation matched. The travel orders checked out. Reed wasn't a civilian with a costume. He was a deputy U.S. Marshal traveling on official business, exactly as he had said from the start. Moreno's tone shifted from manage a situation to stop a mistake. She ordered Reed uncuffed immediately. Crowley hesitated. Not because he lacked the ability to follow instructions, but because uncuffing Reed meant admitting the whole contact had been wrong. Moreno didn't give him room to negotiate. She repeated the order and directed the removal of the cuffs right there in front of the crowd that had watched the takedown. Reed got up slowly and deliberately. No sudden movements, no gestures, just dignity. Moreno separated the officers from Reed and kept the contact controlled. She asked quick questions, confirmed the timeline, and made it clear she wasn't accepting vague officer safety explanations after the fact. Crowley tried to justify the escalation. Moreno didn't argue with him in public. She treated it like what it was: a supervisor securing the scene, gathering basic facts, and preventing further damage. Reed stayed composed and did what most people don't even think to do in the moment. He documented. He requested that all recordings be preserved, including body camera footage, airport surveillance, and any officer reports generated. He didn't threaten. He didn't posture. He simply made it clear that the record mattered and that he expected it to be handled correctly. That request landed differently because of who he was. Reed wasn't guessing at policy. He lived inside procedure. Moreno called for higher command. Chief Daniel Hartman responded after the initial verification came back. By the time he arrived, the crowd had thinned, but the phones had already captured enough. Hartman didn't treat it like a misunderstanding to smooth over. He treated it like an operational failure with legal consequences. Hartman spoke with Moreno first, then with Reed. Reed provided his credentials again and the travel documentation, and Hartman confirmed what Moreno had already established. Reed's identity was legitimate, his orders were legitimate, and the detention had no reasonable basis once credentials were presented. Hartman's next steps were immediate and administrative, not emotional. He pulled Crowley and Benton off duty on the spot. He directed that all body camera footage be preserved without delay. He instructed supervisors to secure any airport surveillance that captured the incident. He ordered that no one involved write creative summaries after the fact. Reports would be written, but the footage would be the anchor. Crowley tried to push back, not loudly, but in the way officers sometimes do when they realize they're about to lose control of the narrative. Hartman shut it down. Crowley and Benton were done for the day. Reed didn't celebrate. He didn't make a scene. He didn't have to. He left with his dignity intact. But the damage was already real. He'd been taken to the floor and cuffed in public while wearing a federal uniform. And the reason wasn't confusion. It was assumption. People had watched it happen. Cameras had captured it. That kind of moment doesn't disappear when the cuffs come off. Over the next hours, the incident didn't stay inside the terminal. Bystander videos started circulating. The body camera footage was now evidence. Hartman's decision to preserve everything meant this wouldn't turn into a he said, she said. It would turn into a review of what happened, what was said, and why two officers felt comfortable treating a confirmed federal officer like a suspect. Internal Affairs was triggered almost immediately because it had to be. A public takedown with questionable justification, racially loaded remarks on camera, and a detained deputy U.S. Marshal creates a tension that local leadership can't contain. And that attention didn't stop at the airport department. Federal scrutiny followed because Reed wasn't just any traveler. He was part of a federal law enforcement agency with its own standards, its own legal teams, and its own expectations when one of its people gets treated like that. By the time the first formal requests for records and footage started landing, Crowley and Benton weren't dealing with a complaint from a random passenger. They were dealing with a documented incident involving a federal officer, multiple recordings, a supervisor who verified legitimacy on scene, and a chief who had already locked down the evidence trail. That's where the real consequences began. Internal Affairs opened the case the same day, not as a courtesy, as a requirement. A takedown in public is already serious. A takedown of a verified federal officer, while comments on camera suggested bias, turns into a liability fire on multiple levels. Chief Daniel Hartman didn't wait for someone else to force his hand. He issued a preservation order for everything tied to the incident: both body cameras, dispatch audio, written logs, and the airport's fixed surveillance feeds. He also ordered Crowley and Benton to submit their initial statements separately. No hallway coaching. No, let's get our stories straight. That detail mattered. Separation prevents teamwork from turning into narrative building. Crowley's first statement tried to lean on the usual cover language: safety, uncertainty, suspicious behavior. The problem was simple. The footage didn't support it. Reed's posture stayed controlled. His hands stayed visible. He produced credentials early. He repeatedly offered a clean verification process. The video captured it. Benton's statement was worse in a different way. He didn't own the escalation, but he also didn't distance himself from it. He stayed in the pocket with Crowley the entire time. He helped maintain the detention. He didn't intervene when Crowley's remarks crossed into racial assumptions. That kind of silence becomes its own action when you're wearing a badge. Investigators moved fast because they knew how these cases age. Memory gets convenient, reports get polished, footage stays blunt. They interviewed Moreno first. Moreno confirmed what she saw and what she verified. Reed's marshal credentials and travel documentation checked out immediately, and nothing about Reed's behavior justified forcing him to the floor once credentials were presented. Moreno also documented the crowd presence and confirmed that multiple civilians were recording before she arrived. Then Internal Affairs interviewed Reed. Reed didn't show up emotional. He showed up prepared. He gave a timeline, listed who said what, and identified the exact moment the stop shifted from verification to humiliation. He also provided his official orders and noted the agency contacts who could confirm them. That wasn't posturing. That was Reed making sure the investigation couldn't be steered into vagueness. The federal side didn't wait around either. Once Reed's agency learned what happened, they requested the preserved footage and incident records through formal channels. They also requested any prior complaints tied to Crowley and Benton, including use of force history and bias-related allegations. That's standard when an event suggests a pattern. The department couldn't stall without making it worse. Hartman had already locked the evidence down, so the requests were processed. As the footage got reviewed, the case stopped being about a misunderstanding. The recordings showed how the assumptions formed, how the tone shifted, and how Crowley escalated after being offered verification. The remarks didn't land as accidental. They landed as worldview. That's why they hit so hard when replayed in a quiet room with investigators. Crowley tried to reframe it as instincts. He claimed he couldn't trust credentials on site. He suggested criminals impersonate officers. He tried to make it sound like he'd been doing the public a favor. Internal Affairs pushed back with the obvious questions. If the concern was impersonation, why reject the offer to verify through dispatch and a supervisor? Why escalate to a takedown with a compliant subject? Why make comments about Reed not matching the role instead of focusing on verification? Why continue after the credentials were presented? The answers didn't come out clean. And by then, the public side was moving too. Bystander videos were spreading. People were tagging the airport department. Comment sections filled up with the same pattern. People saying they'd experienced similar treatment. People arguing about authority. People focusing on the fact that Reed didn't do anything aggressive and still ended up on the floor. That pressure didn't decide the investigation, but it raised the cost of a quiet cover-up. Internal Affairs completed an early findings memo, and it didn't read like a minor policy issue. It read like a failure of judgment, a failure of procedure, and a failure to intervene. Crowley faced the main charge, unreasonable detention and use of force, plus conduct violations tied to the recorded remarks. The department also flagged credibility issues because once an officer's explanations don't match the footage, the damage goes beyond one incident. Courts remember that. Benton faced a different lane: failure to intervene, failure to de-escalate, and failure to report misconduct appropriately. He didn't throw Reed to the ground, but he stood there and helped keep the cuffs on. He watched the train coming and stayed on the tracks. Hartman placed both officers on formal administrative status while the process moved forward. Crowley was already off the street. Benton was too. No back next week. No quiet reassignment to a softer post. Behind the scenes, city attorneys and department counsel got involved because they had to. This wasn't going to be handled with a stern talk and a training reminder. The footage had legal weight, and Reed's career and reputation had been attacked in public. Reed's next move was predictable for someone who understood accountability systems. He retained counsel and filed a civil rights lawsuit alleging unlawful detention, excessive force, and discriminatory treatment. The filing didn't depend on emotion. It depended on evidence, and the evidence was already stacked. Bodycam, bystander video, supervisor verification, chief's preservation order, and internal findings pointing in the same direction. Once the lawsuit hit, Crowley's employment situation became a countdown. Departments can survive accusations. They don't survive footage that contradicts their officer, especially when federal scrutiny is in the mix. Crowley fought it anyway. He appealed internally. He leaned on union representation. He tried to argue procedure. None of it changed what the cameras showed. The department terminated Crowley. After termination, the state-level certification process followed. Decertification isn't a headline word to most people, but inside law enforcement, it's a career ender. It blocks the easy move to another department. It marks you as unfit to serve. Benton didn't get fired, but he didn't walk away clean. The department disciplined him for failing to intervene and for backing an escalation that should have been stopped. His record took the hit, his standing dropped, and his role changed. The message was clear. Being the quiet partner doesn't protect you when you enable misconduct on camera. By the time those employment decisions landed, the lawsuit was already pushing towards the part departments hate most, discovery. Because discovery doesn't care about anyone's pride. It demands documents, training records, prior complaints, and communications. It drags patterns into daylight, and that's exactly where Reed had aimed it. The lawsuit didn't sit in the background. Reed's legal team pushed it forward like they expected the records to tell the real story, because that's usually where these cases either die quietly or explode publicly. Discovery started, and the department had to produce what it had. Body cam footage, dispatch logs, supervisor notes, training records, prior complaints tied to Crowley and Benton, use of force reports. Anything connected to how stops and credential verification were supposed to work inside that airport. This wasn't a debate anymore. It was paperwork and video. Reed's team focused on a simple timeline. Credentials presented early, verification offered early. Crowley rejected it. Crowley escalated anyway. Moreno verified within minutes once she arrived. Hartman preserved evidence and pulled the officers. Every step lined up. The department's legal counsel saw the same problem Reed's team saw. A jury wouldn't need special training to understand what happened. A calm, compliant federal officer got forced to the floor while wearing a uniform, and the reason sounded like bias on camera. That's the kind of case that turns into a public lesson. Settlement talks began while the department tried to limit the damage. Reed didn't treat the settlement like a payout. He treated it like a lever. Money mattered because harm happened, but reforms mattered because this wasn't just about him. If the department wanted closure, it needed to change how this could happen again. The final settlement was major, big enough to sting, big enough that leadership couldn't pretend it was nuisance value. Part of the resolution included written terms tied to accountability reforms, not just a check. Then the department had to prove it was serious. Chief Hartman announced a set of changes that hit the exact failure points from the incident. Credential verification protocol. When someone presents law enforcement credentials, officers must verify through dispatch supervisor channels before escalating, unless there's a clear, immediate threat. Stop documentation requirements. Officers must document the specific basis for a stop and any escalation steps with timestamps tied to Bodycam. Duty to intervene policy enforcement. Officers who stand by during misconduct face discipline, not just coaching. Bodycam audit triggers. Certain keywords, complaint types, or use of force patterns automatically trigger a review. Supervisor response standards. A supervisor has to respond quickly, when a stop involves credentials, detention, or use of force in a high-visibility public setting. Training upgrades, not feel-good lectures. Scenario-based training built around real footage and correct decision-making under stress. Crowley's outcome stayed final. He was fired, and the certification process ended his ability to hop to another department like nothing happened. That wasn't revenge. That was the system saying he couldn't be trusted with authority. Benton's outcome followed the logic the public usually misses. He didn't get treated as invisible just because Crowley was the loud one. He got disciplined for failing to intervene and for supporting the escalation. His career didn't end, but it changed. Reduced standing, restricted duties, mandatory retraining, and ongoing monitoring. The department wanted it on record that silence isn't neutral. Reed kept working. He didn't become a media personality. He didn't chase attention. He returned to duty with his reputation intact, in the only way that matters. Officially. Quietly. With proof on his side. But the personal cost didn't vanish. People underestimate that part. Being forced to the floor in public while wearing your own badge hits different. It tells you exactly how fast authority can turn on you when someone decides you don't fit the picture in their head. Still, Reed got something most people never get. A clean record of the truth and a system that couldn't erase it. That's the real takeaway here. COM didn't protect Reed by itself. Credentials didn't protect him by themselves. What protected him was documentation, oversight, and supervisors who chose facts over loyalty. Cameras didn't create accountability, but they made it unavoidable. So here's the question for you. If you were standing there watching, would you have pulled your phone out and recorded? Or would you have kept walking and hoped someone else did it? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories where evidence beats arrogance and power trips backfire, like the video and subscribe.